Tonight, fighting for stricter gun laws in Texas.
I hope that they hear us, and I hope it makes a difference, and I hope that they do change the laws.
The legislation survivors and families of the Uvalde mass shooting hope make it to the governor's desk. Plus, will the Supreme Court sink student loan forgiveness?
Maybe that's not something they should undertake on their own.
The arguments from both sides as millions of borrowers remain in limbo. And later, bringing back business incentives. The latest priorities from the Texas House Speaker to entice more major companies to expand to Texas. Capitol Tonight starts right now. Thanks for joining us here on Capitol Tonight. I'm Karina Kling. Families of Uvalde shooting victims continue to press lawmakers to pass gun control legislation. They were back at the Capitol today. Without mentioning Uvalde, Governor Greg Abbott did declare school safety a priority he wants lawmakers to tackle during his State of the State address. He also proposed a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence for illegally possessing a gun, asserting this.
Most gun crimes are committed by criminals who possess guns illegally.
But that's not true in mass shootings. According to an investigation by ProPublica and the Texas Tribune, the majority of the state's 19 mass shootings over the past 6 decades were carried out by men who legally got guns. That includes the Uvalde shooter. Guns were illegally obtained in just 3. More than 50 people affected by the mass shooting in Uvalde rallied at the Capitol today. They want the governor and other elected leaders to listen to their repeated calls for stronger gun laws. Our Charlotte Scott has more.
End gun violence! Texans marched to the Capitol on Tuesday with one goal: call on lawmakers to pass stricter gun legislation. End gun violence! It's been more than 9 months since a gunman killed 19 students and 2 teachers at Robb Elementary School. Arnulfo Reyes was a teacher there, and the memories of that day are still fresh.
The active shooter going into the classrooms and shooting and being shot myself, and then him shooting my students.
Reyes survived a shot to the arm and another in his back. He and others came to the Capitol to be a voice for those who died. They want lawmakers to pass stronger gun laws.
That's my goal here. If I can do something for one of the senators, legislators, to change their mind, then I did my job.
A group of Democratic senators has filed a bill to raise the minimum age to purchase an assault weapon to 21, require background checks for all firearm sales, require a cooling off period of 72 hours after the purchase of a firearm, and allow the temporary removal of firearms from those who are in imminent danger to themselves or others. Although they have Democrats on their side, Republicans likely won't go for any of this.
We've got to be really careful about just restrictions that we place on honest, law-abiding Texans because of the actions of the sinister and the evil.
Members of the GOP have instead advocated for hardening schools and increasing mental health resources.
This is not good policy. This is attempts to look good without doing any good.
Gun Owners of America is also supporting a bill that would allow teachers to carry a handgun on campus without school approval.
When we look at the Uvalde video, the anti-gunners look at it and say, see, this is the reason we need more gun control. But when we look at that video, we see 19 kids and 2 teachers who were no one there to defend them.
Do your job! But teachers like Reyes don't want to carry a gun on campus. And if that law passes, he doesn't know if he'll ever go back to teaching.
That doesn't even sound right, you know? The guns don't have a place in school.
Reyes and the other advocates say they'll keep coming to the Capitol until gun laws change in Texas. But that day may be a long way away. For Capitol Tonight, I'm Charlotte Scott.
Joining us now to discuss all this further is State Senator Roland Gutierrez. He represents Uvalde, is pushing for gun reforms, and was also part of the rally today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Karina.
I know you filed a lot of legislation you say would address gun violence, yet most are non-starters with Republicans. So how do you change the conversation? I mean, where do you think this really goes realistically this session?
Yeah, well, I think first off today is important, right? People continuing to advocate for change, coming to the Capitol. Uvalde families have now been here on 4 different occasions. They are knocking on doors. They're going to continue to do that. Santa Fe parents, shooting occurred 4 years ago. Those parents are coming in, and I'm making new friends. continuing to advocate is the most important thing, so that hopefully somehow we get into the hearts and minds of Republican legislators, let them know that what these people are asking for is common sense gun safety, not trying to take anybody's guns away. They're here so that this never happens to another child again.
What kind of conversations have you had with your Republican colleagues, and have some of these families had with them? I mean, does having them there and just being there in person change the conversation?
Well, I hope that it does. My conversations with my colleagues, a few of them in the Senate, have been susceptible, or agreeable rather, to the idea of an age increase. Okay. They still want to remain nameless, so I think that they're still concerned about the right wing of their party, and I understand that. And I implore people on the right to understand that we're not trying to take your guns away. We're just trying to make your kids safer in school. We're not we don't want to infringe on the Second Amendment. We just don't want an 18-year-old to go buy an AR-15 like he's buying a soda water.
Yeah. The governor is pushing school safety, and I know that there have been some bipartisan conversations around that. What does that look like? What does that look like for you to be something that would be a good push forward?
Well, we filed a bill to have a cop in every school, an additional DPS trooper in every school. We can't afford it. The Senate has got $600 million for school hardening in the budget. The House has $750 million. TEA, we just discovered, has a white paper for the amount that we're asking for, which is $2 billion a year. That is the number that we need to make our schools a little bit safer, and we need to do that. We have the money. Yeah. It's our money, and it should be used in the right way rather than give everybody a box of chicken for a tax break. We should do what's right for our children and make sure that they're safe.
What about arming more teachers? One of your Republican colleagues, as mentioned, wants to expand that program even more. What's your conversation like on that, and what you've heard from teachers themselves? Because we've heard from a lot who say that they don't want that program.
77% of teachers don't want to have to be armed. They don't want to have guns in schools. They don't want to carry guns in schools. It's not their job. They train to teach, not to be law enforcement. Yeah. That's just the end of that argument. But at the end of the day, we had over 376 cops, good guys with guns, that didn't do a damn thing for 77 minutes. I think all that's going to do is make us more dangerous.
Senator, while I have you here, your political future, there's been some chatter about you potentially challenging U.S. Senator Ted Cruz. Will you do that?
Well, look, Karina, I'm focused on this issue right now and getting through this session. That is the most important thing. This issue is something that I will talk about in public office for the rest of my life. I have seen hundreds of hours of body cam footage. I've seen children with their faces shot off. There is no horror like this. I will never stop talking about it until we can get something done in this space. And so that's the only thing I'm focused on.
Senator Roland Gutierrez, we will leave it there. I hope you'll come back and chat with us some more throughout the session. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Turning now to Washington, where members of the Supreme Court's conservative majority expressed doubts about the legality of President Joe Biden's student debt relief plan. They heard arguments today from two different challenges. Arena Diamante has more from Washington.
GEBT. Hundreds of student loan borrowers rallied outside the Supreme Court as the justices weighed the legality of President Joe Biden's plan to forgive $400 billion in debts owed by 40 million federal student loan recipients.
The way that I'm able to live here in D.C. is through student loans. School is very expensive, and there definitely is a deficit when looking at people of color, specifically Black people, within the margins of who owes the most.
Law student Jasmine Marchbanks Owens of California said student loans help to expand access to education, but that graduating with so much debt can be overwhelming.
If people have to take out so much money in loans and are facing these high numbers of debt, people are less likely wanting to be or being able to be educated and to move our country along.
During Tuesday's hearing, members of the court's conservative majority questioned whether the administration had the authority to launch the ambitious program without clear authorization from Congress.
If they haven't acted on it, then maybe that's a good lesson to say for the president or the administrative bureaucracy that maybe that's not something they should undertake on their own.
The administration said it can act under the HEROES Act, a 2003 law that gives the education secretary broad power to protect borrowers affected by wars, disasters, and national emergencies. The administration said the pandemic was such an emergency.
Congress could not have made this much more clear.
A lawyer for one of the states challenging Biden's program argued otherwise.
The secretary here asserts a breathtaking power to do anything that he thinks might reduce the risk of borrowers defaulting even years after a national emergency arises.
Justices will have to consider the threshold question of whether the challengers have suffered enough harm to have the right to sue. The GOP state said they do, arguing a state-created student loan servicer in Missouri known as Mohila would lose revenue. But liberal and conservative justices said Mohila is not an official party to the challenge.
If Mohila is an arm of the state, why didn't you just strong-arm Mohila and say you've got to pursue this suit?
President Biden's plan would forgive up to $20,000 in student loan debt to borrowers meeting income guidelines. The program is on hold until the Supreme Court issues its decision, which is expected in late spring or early summer. In Washington, Rena Diamante, Capital Tonight.
More than 1 million Texans have already been approved for debt relief under President Biden's program. According to the research group Education Data Initiative, about $120 billion in such debt is tied to Texas residents, and the average student loan debt is nearly $33,000. One working Texan says debt relief would help borrowers like himself have a more stable future.
There are a lot of people like me who just want to get a start on their life, have kids, have a family, own a house, and you can't do those things when you're sitting under a mountain of debt.
More than 3 million Texans are eligible for student debt relief under the president's plan. Still to come on Capitol Tonight, making the case for corporate tax breaks, the latest push by a top Texas leader to improve the state's economic development tools. And later, it's been 30 years since a siege near Waco began, why the deadly standoff led to significant law enforcement changes. Welcome back. Let's get a check now of some of the other political stories making headlines across the state. More Texas cities are now eligible for millions of dollars from the federal government to prevent terrorist attacks. The Department of Homeland Security announced medium and small-sized areas can also benefit from its preparedness grants. Austin is now included and could get $1.5 million. 3 other Texas metro areas will get funding too, including San Antonio, DFW, and Houston. Former State Senator Wendy Davis is joining the Texas-based political advocacy arm of Planned Parenthood. She's a new senior advisor for Planned Parenthood Texas Votes. This comes as court battles continue over access to reproductive health care in Texas since Roe v. Wade was overturned last year. Davis is known for a 13-hour filibuster of an anti-abortion measure back in 2013. Texas House Speaker Dade Phelan announced more priorities for the legislative session. The selected bills are geared toward funding community colleges and creating incentives for big businesses to come to Texas. Phelan said approving these proposals would boost local economies and create jobs. We want to bring in our political analysts now with us tonight, Republican Ted DeLisi and Katie Naranjo, the chair of the Travis County Democratic Party. Good to see you both.
Good to be here.
Ted, I'll start with you. This Phelan priority on incentives for businesses, Governor Abbott also saying that the state will revamp an economic development program after incentives for it expired. Not getting too into the weeds, but Chapter 313, as most people know it, a politically touchy issue. I mean, what do you think this looks like moving forward?
I think it is politically touchy. You have some conservatives who say, who use a term that I think has some resonance among some voters, and that is tax incentives for large businesses to relocate to Texas corporate welfare? Or is it something that every other state does, therefore Texas has to do it in order to compete for these strong businesses? And I think if you're someone that owns a business that's already in Texas and you're saying, well, I want to expand my business here, there's no resources for you. So is there a baseline fairness argument? I think that this is something that in a very conservative Texas Senate, I'm sort of interested because I think this is one of those issues that even though the speaker and the governor have signaled that they're for it, I think there's some some hesitancy among your average Republican lawmakers to support it. I think the Democrats overall would support it.
Well, and the House passed to keep Chapter 313 around. The Senate did not last time around, correct?
Right.
Yeah. Katie, where do Democrats stand on this?
When it comes to tax breaks for corporations, we're looking at, one, are they then getting incentives to actually make more jobs and to invest in the local economy? And I think it's up to local entities and needs to be at the local level where those entities are making those decisions in regards to whether or not they need Chapter 313 in order to be able to have that tool or not, rather than the state having a statewide jurisdiction to determine how companies will be incentivized to come into our communities. It's our local governance that will know that best. And also, there needs to be stipulations. I think just like Ted said, we need to make sure that these are companies coming in to employ Texans, and that we have to have standards for which they receive any of these incentives.
Yeah, obviously a big conversation for lawmakers at the Capitol. I want to turn to our top story tonight, calls from Uvalde families for stronger gun laws. Ted, you know, we've heard Republicans say that they don't want to go any further or do anything to restrict gun laws, but where do you see any movement on this? Where do you see any kind of consensus on kind of what they're calling for and what lawmakers might do?
I don't see any political momentum right now on the Republican side to wholesale revisit gun laws or Second Amendment rights laws. I do think that there is going to be some significant conversation and funding around school hardening. I know that that doesn't necessarily satiate the parents that were there today. I think there's going to be some significant new and focused conversation on the connection between schools and mental health.
Sure.
And I think the one thing that's out there, and I know when you have people come to Austin and they sort of put on T-shirts and they have rallies, you get all sorts of opinions. But I think the idea that you have to be 21 years old to buy a handgun, but you have to be 18 years old to buy a sort of long rifle weapon. I think that's something that I don't know if that's going to work its way out this session. But I think for a lot of Texans, is we've already gotten to the point where you have to be 21 to buy a handgun. What is it about a long weapon that shouldn't also be 21? I think that one is probably the best argument to see something happen. I think that so-called red flag laws, which we saw suggested just gently by the governor after, I believe, Santa Fe in a report, this would be taking a so-called someone who has a court-ordered mental illness, having their weapons taken away from them, as long as it's a judicial process. Those are the two places that I think have the greatest possibility for a real debate.
Yeah, and we're seeing even some more changes on some of those gun laws that you mentioned in terms of the age. Katie, if school safety's the focus, I mean, what can Democrats get behind? Senator Gutierrez was mentioning an additional DPS officer in every school. I mean, that's obviously going to be costly.
It's not just schools, right? It's churches, it's Walmart. I mean, we're the state that after the Walmart shooting decided to make open carry available versus still having some restrictions on the books. And it's not just folks showing up at the Capitol having a variation of opinions. 86% of Texans want background checks. 80% of Texans want to raise the age to 21, the minimum age. I can buy a gun, but I can't buy a beer. That's a problem, right? And I think it's interesting that Speaker Phelan earlier in the session said that he doesn't understand how we can get around school safety and gun safety without actually talking about guns. Sure. And to leave millions of federal dollars, not coming into Texas as the red flags, these are all issues that are extreme.
Yeah, Katie, Ted, we're going to have to leave it there. We will be right back. Years ago today, the siege on a compound near Waco began. The weeks-long standoff between a religious cult leader and several law enforcement agencies captured the attention of reporters across the nation, including our Brett Shipp. He was there during the siege and shares his story.
My coverage of the Branch Davidian nightmare actually started on February 26 of '93 in New York City, where I'd gone to cover another tragedy, the first terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. 6 died, more than 1,000 injured. But 2 days later, while I was still in New York, another disaster. 10 miles east of Waco, an army of ATF agents made an assault on the Branch Davidian compound, where a self-styled prophet named David Koresh and 100 of his followers had already been tipped off. An epic gun battle ensued, caught on camera, quickly devolved into a modern-day OK Corral. 4 agents and 6 Davidians died that day, and so the standoff began. I arrived on day 2 of the 51-day American nightmare. By most accounts, a tragic miscalculation by federal agents of how to engage and detain a cult figure surrounded by innocent women and children, but armed with an arsenal of automatic weapons. We in the media set up camp on the perimeter and watched from a distance the daily chess match of fragile negotiations and escalating pressure tactics. A cunning and confident Koresh versus the bickering collection of local lawmen and frustrated federal agents who on day 51 decided they'd waited long enough. They attacked the compound with tanks, pumping volatile tear gas inside. The buildings caught fire and were soon engulfed in flames. When the smoke cleared, 76 people inside, including Koresh, died. It was a day, a horrifying moment in time, for me as a reporter and for the entire nation.
And in the 30 years since the standoff, law enforcement has improved how it responds in a crisis. The ATF standardized training for its agents and got better equipment. The FBI also made changes like having its tactical and negotiating teams train together. That is all the time that we have tonight. We are back tomorrow with the latest in Texas politics. Until then, thanks for watching. Stay safe and have a great night.